I just received the very sad news that Gonzalo Lira passed away in the Ukrainian prison. I can't believe my first episode for 2024 is to remember him. I had the privilege to interview him last April. I believe this is one of the last interviews, if not the last interview he conducted before his arrest. In the interview, I asked him questions about the Ukrainian war, about a whole range of geopolitical questions, and it was a great interview. I really enjoyed it. And so did he, I believe. He also told me that he would like to visit China sometime, possibly after the war. And to remember him, I just want to repost this interview, and I leave the Chinese subtitle on. Gonzalo, you will be deeply missed.
So let's start. Now, my first question would be for you, since you are inside Ukraine.
Mhm.
So what is the latest? Can you give us some update? In particular, what is the significance of this Bakhmut? Why is it so important?
Well, Bakhmut originally was important because it was the second major defensive line of the Kiev regime insofar as holding back the advance of the Russian armies. And what the Russian armies basically did was they have turned this conflict into a war of attrition. A war of attrition is, of course, just trying to grind down the enemy forces. Many people think that it's like a 1-to-1 ratio. No, the idea of an attritional warfare is economy of force. Lose as few people as possible on your side and inflict the maximum damage on the opposing side. And so the first instance of industrial warfare that used an attrition strategy was the American Civil War in the mid-19th century. And the best strategy insofar as an attritional war to defend is to constantly pull your army away and have the aggressor chase you, which is what happened in the American Civil War. Excuse me. And so what happens is that, but the worst way is to just crash two opposing armies, just crash and create trenches and fight that way, which is what has happened in this conflict. This happened, of course, in the First World War, famously with the trench warfare. Now, what has happened in this conflict is that the Russians are much superior insofar as their basic tactics and operational approach to attritional warfare. What they've been doing is they don't send waves of troops. What they do is that they fire artillery to destroy the Kiev regime forces. And once they have sufficiently denigrated those opposing forces, only then do they send in soldiers to sort of like mop up and take over. Okay. Now, this strategy for the Russian side has been extremely effective. They've inflicted tremendous losses on the Kiev regime. The current estimates are varied, but it is estimated that the Kiev regime has lost, between 175,000 to over 200,000 killed in action, which is a catastrophic number. And insofar as the Russian side is concerned, most analysts agree with numbers that have been created, that have been researched by the BBC and Mediazona, that put the total combined Russian losses, that is, Russian armed forces, Wagner, LPR, DPR, and Chechen forces, at under 20,000. So as you can see, it's a lopsided number. It's roughly 8-to-1. So on the one hand, the Russians are destroying the Kiev regime forces, and on the other, not only are they destroying them in such a lopsided number of 8-to-1, but the Russians themselves have so much more in reserve. So the outcome of this conflict is not in doubt. It has not been in doubt for quite some time, and especially as of now. Now, Bakhmut, to go back to your question, is important because it was a transportation hub, because in and of itself, the town of Bakhmut is relatively small. Before the war, it was about 75,000 people, but multiple roads and multiple rail lines crossed through it. And that's why it became originally a very important hub in the defensive line of the Kiev regime, so they could move material and equipment back and forth. But what has happened is that it has now become a political objective because the Kiev regime put so many forces to defend the city and lost so many. It's estimated that in the month of February, they lost upwards of 11,000 men. just that city. And so what has happened is that, it's like a bad gambler. He keeps betting on red, thinking that this time it'll turn out a winner, but he loses, so he puts even more chips on red and more and more and more. And that's what's happened to the Kiev regime. They have bet so much on Bakhmut that they can't give it up. And so that's why the fighting is so fierce there. And that's why it is the largest battle of this entire conflict, much larger than Mariupol, and the largest single battle probably since the Korean War, quite frankly, because it has been incredible, the kind of men who have been killed and wounded, and the amount of materiel that has been destroyed in this single battle. So yeah, it's going to keep on going, and the Kiev regime is preparing an offensive that they've been announcing quite some time now. And you see, the Kiev regime has to defend Bakhmut because they've invested so much. And so there's a notion that they're going to go on a counteroffensive on Bakhmut, but the Russians are prepared. So those men who go into this counteroffensive, they might be able to bend the Russian lines, certainly, and make the Russians retreat. But the Russians in this entire conflict have shown themselves more than happy to give up terrain in order to conserve their forces. And so if the Kiev regime were to counterattack on Bakhmut and perhaps even take it back, it would not matter, because for the Russians, this war is not about territory. It's about diminishing the Kiev regime forces, which they are accomplishing. And so if they have to give up some land in order to achieve that goal of diminishing Kiev regime forces, they're happy to do so. They've done it before. And so this war the outcome is inevitable. The Russians will win this conflict. And this offensive that the Kiev regime is planning, because this offensive is not just in Bakhmut, but also in Zaporozhye, it looks like the last roll of the dice for the Kiev regime. And they will probably lose rather catastrophically. And it's terrible because they should be negotiating peace, but instead they continue with this war that they cannot win. It's just mathematically not possible. And for the Russians, of course, this is existential. So they are going to use every effort and every means necessary to win this conflict. So that's where we stand at this time.
Now, do you think once they lose Bakhmut, do you think that will be the end of the war?
Possibly,
Okay.
but we won't know. You see, you have to look back on the First World War when the Imperial Germany was fighting the Allies. They kept on fighting and fighting and fighting, and then all of a sudden they collapsed. And that's usually what happens in attritional warfare. You have the side that is losing, it continues to fight to the very end. In fact, in the American Civil War that I mentioned before, the Confederates actually won the last 2 or 3 battles of the Civil War. But what happens in attrition, it's basically the army gets to a point of being so weak that it just collapses. It does not have the ability to continue fighting. When that moment is reached cannot really be predicted. After the fact, many times you can see, oh yeah, that was the moment, that was the end. But while it's happening, you have to wait and see. The outcome is not in doubt. It's like, to put it to you in a simple way, I don't know when it's going to rain, maybe today, maybe tomorrow, but I know it will rain at some point. Okay. It's inevitable. And so that's where the stage we're in. We don't know when it will end, but we do know that it will end, and we know more or less how it will end. And how it will end, of course, is that the Kiev regime forces will simply collapse because their losses have been too high and they cannot sustain military operations anymore.
Okay. I have another question is for Ukraine, for this country, Ukraine, and for the people, regular people, Ukrainians who are living in Ukraine. Is it better that they have their own country, Ukraine, or is it better they're part of Russia? This country is fairly new, right? They only existed for 30 years. And for 30 years, I think that the total count is they had 18 presidents. Seems to me very unstable.
The reason it's so unstable is because there are essentially 2 large ethnic groups in Ukraine since the collapse of the Soviet Union. There is, in the south and the east, ethnic Russians who speak Russian. And then there's the central and western areas, which are ethnically Ukrainian, although many of them, if not most of them, speak Russian as their first language. Okay, and so there's always been this ethnic divide. Also, what happens is the east and the south is more industrial and richer because of it. And also the best farmland is in the east and the south. The famous black soil earth of Ukraine, it's there in the east and the south, which is precisely the area that is ethnically Russian. And so the ethnic Russians feel that they have not had a political voice. They feel that they have been taken advantage of by Kiev because of high taxes and other financial issues. And so there's always been this tension within the country because it is not ethnically unified. And the ethnic Russian minority, but it's a very slight minority. It's like 45%. You know, it creates this tension of like almost like a civil war. Now, if you were to ask the ethnic Russians, would they prefer to be part of the Russian Federation? Most certainly. You know, the areas that were annexed by Russia, Zaporozhia, Kherson, Lugansk and Donetsk, they voted overwhelmingly to join the Russian Federation because they are Russian, they are ethnic Russian. And over the past 8 years, they have been consistently being shelled and attacked by the Kiev regime. And so they, of course, want to join the Russian Federation. Other areas of Ukraine, you'd have to look at each individual area. But the five that Russia now controls, which is Crimea, Lugansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhia, and Kherson, they all want to be part of Russia, and they are part of Russia, and they're never going to leave Russia at this point. I mean, it's already signed, sealed, and delivered. But the other areas that are predominantly Russian, like Kharkov, where I am located, Sumy, Dnipropetrovsk, or Dnipro as it's currently called, yeah, those will likely, I think, will likely become part of the Russian Federation. Because I do believe that in this conflict, since the Kiev regime refuses to negotiate because of the Western powers that control the Kiev regime, that they're going to have to fight to the bitter end. And once that happens, it's very clear that the Russians are going to physically take possession of the entire country, and they will likely dismember it. And the parts that are ethnically Russian, predominantly ethnic Russian, which is, as I said before, the east and the south, Odessa, Dnipro, Kharkov, they will go to the Russian Federation. That's my thinking at this time.
Then the Ukraine part of it, they would be more independent. Is that?
I think that it'll become like a independent state called Ukraine that will be landlocked without any outlet to the sea. And I think it will probably be controlled by a government that is extremely friendly to the Russians. I mean, extremely friendly to the Russians. And certainly NATO will not be allowed into this rump Ukraine state. That's what I think will happen.
One question I think about lots of the Chinese, and including me, are curious about is why the Europeans hate Russia so much?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I've discussed that very point with a number of people. And I think the best answer is you hate the ones you have wronged.
Okay.
It's a line from Tacitus. You hate the ones that you have wronged, you know, because you feel guilty about it. Because the European powers have always treated Russia badly since the Crimean War. In World War I, during when the Russian Revolution happened, the British refused to help the Romanov dynasty and other noblemen in Russia to escape from the Bolsheviks, and of course they were killed. I think that guilt plays a large part of it. I also think that there is an aspect of during the 90s, the West exploited Russia mercilessly and just exploited its industry and its resources and stole and supported oligarchs who were very pernicious to Russia. And they want a return to that so they can continue to exploit Russia. And Russia at this time is strong enough that that's not going to happen simply. And so they lust after the resources that Russia possesses, the natural resources, energy resources, mineral resources, human resources as well, because the Russians are extremely educated people, hardworking people. And so I think that it's a combination of guilt for the past actions, lust for the riches of Russia, and also just ego, that they cannot accept that a country that 30 years ago during the 90s was just really broken and now is a major world power, and indisputably a major world power, with very capable leadership and a people who are very aware that their existence as a people is dependent on this conflict. And so I think it's a combination of factors that lead the West to hate Russians with a passion. It's incredible. And I think it's kind of sick, to tell you the truth, because they really hate them. I mean, one could hate, for instance, the political leadership of a country for pursuing some goal that one doesn't like. That's perfectly fine. But to hate the entire people in such a grotesque way, to call them vatniks, to call them orcs, to call them subhumans, it's truly bizarre. And I think it's a shock to the Russians themselves. It's certainly a shock to me, because I'm a man of the West, and I have never seen anything like this. It's just extraordinary. And it's deeply depressing to realize I don't use this word lightly, because a lot of people use the word racism all the time. Oh, you're doing this, you're racist. And I think that that's nonsense. But in this particular case, it is a racism that is just bizarre. And it's truly sick. And by the way, to your Chinese audience members, this kind of racism that is being directed towards the Russians, it's slowly but surely being directed towards the Chinese as well, as the United States prepares to go to war with China.
I'm not even sure it's so slow.
Yeah, but it's happening. We're seeing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and then talking about the hate, right? So I don't know if you paid attention, not that long ago, the Russian ambassador to the US, he wrote an article about how the US art area, they are changing a lot of artists from ethnically Russian to Ukrainian.
Oh yeah.
There's some famous paintings, in that, in different.
Yeah, one was called the Russian dancers, and now they changed it to Ukrainian dancers.
Something like that. It's some totally bizarre thing that they're doing right now. And so
well, you read George Orwell, right? You read George Orwell in 1984?
Yeah, 1984.
Yeah. It's the West has become totalitarian.
Yeah.
The Western regimes are totalitarian in their actions, in every action that they carry out. They are also terrorists. The Western states are terrorist states. What they accused Iraq, Libya, they accused everybody of being, they are. The destruction of the Nord Stream bombing, for instance, the destruction of Nord Stream pipeline. That was an act of state-sponsored terrorism. The assassinations of Suleiman in Iran, for instance. All of this just shows that the Western regimes have gone insane. And I think that the Chinese and the Russians are playing the game very cleverly, because they are being patient, slow, incremental. I think that is the way to defeat this insanity of the West, because you have to keep in mind something, that the American economy, the Western economies in general, are extraordinarily fragile. They're falling apart, really. In terms of internal infrastructure in the United States, it is a complete disaster. In terms of Europe, they're a broken people insofar as their economies are concerned, and the Americans are even in worse shape. And so I think that the smartest thing that the Eurasian powers can do, Russia and China and their allies, is to just be slow, patient, methodical. Because when you have somebody who's going insane, he thrashes around. And so the smart thing is just to wait, to stand back and let him thrash around and exhaust himself before you make any move. And never make any sudden moves, with crazy people. If you move suddenly, the crazy person might grab you and do something horrible to you. So the smart thing is to just be slow and incremental insofar as dealing with the West, because it breaks my heart to say this, but the West is lost. Because as I mentioned, I'm a man of the West. I am culturally of the West, ethnically of the West. I'm part German, Andalusian, Basque, Danish. I am a man of the West culturally. I trace my cultural ancestry from Chile to Spain to Rome to the Greeks. That is my cultural background. And so when I see this happening in the West, it just completely breaks my heart. All of the goodness of the Enlightenment has been destroyed by the current crop of leadership in the West. And it's happened so quickly. That's the thing that's so startling, because what is happening now would have been inconceivable 25 years ago. The actions of the Biden regime or the Western regimes, in France, in Germany, in the UK, 25 years ago, people would have said that's impossible. We would never do such things, but they are doing them now. And the level of repression of the people in the West is incredible. And what's funny is that they keep saying that China, the government of China, represses the Chinese people relentlessly. But it seems that this odd projecting onto the Chinese, projecting onto the Russians, what is in fact going on in the West, because the repression, the information repression, the propaganda in the West is relentless. It is never ending. And on top of that, let's not even discuss the sexual degeneracy that is unfolding and the perversions and depravity that are being inflicted on the children of the West. I'm talking, young children of sexual perversions that are normalized among them. Many people speculate in the West, and they are not crazy. They are saying that it is not inconceivable that in a short period of time, 2 to 4 years, there will be a normalization of pedophilia, which is disgusting, but that is the path that the West is taking. The West has gone insane, and there is no way to fix the situation in the West, unfortunately.
Yeah, and that's part of the question I have is that Scott Ritter, because of the ambassador wrote that article about destroying Russian culture, that kind of thing. So Scott Ritter wrote an article. In his article, he mentioned that there is a lack of really good people who understand Russia working at the US government. I think the same is true about China. I don't see any really competent people who understand China working in the US government. Maybe that's true with Iran, with Venezuela, with just any number of countries that there seems like a lack of really capable people who understand others.
Yes,
now,
exactly.
Why is that? Why don't they
that's a very good question. I've given it a great deal of thought, as a matter of fact. And what has happened is that the people who are in leadership positions today, they arose within very stable institutional frameworks. And so they have extremely limited experience with the rest of the world. On top of that, there has been a cultural fashion in the West over the last 50 odd years of prioritizing the subjective experience as opposed to trying to empathize with the other, okay? And so what I feel is more important than what you feel. I don't care about what you feel, it's what I feel, okay? And it's a narcissism that has become culturally ingrained in the West. And so when you take this engendered narcissism, ingrained narcissism, and you combined it with a very rigid social establishments that do not really change. So you start having a leadership class that emerges that has very limited experience, if no experience at all, with people from other cultures, and no interest in understanding the point of view of the other. They only care about themselves. And so they demand that the rest of the world, like spoiled children, they demand that the rest of the world act as they want them to, as opposed to understanding the point of view of the other, understanding the priorities of the other, and adapting so as to work together. So what I see is that the Chinese and the Russians, they don't try to change other people. They try to work with other people so that the other and themselves can achieve some practical goal of mutual utility. But they don't try to change the other, whereas the Americans, the Westerners, basically say, if you're not just like us, you're evil, you're the enemy, and you must be destroyed. And this is basically the attitude of spoiled children. And that's what's happened in the West. The leaders today are spoiled children, and they are incompetent without question, because what has happened is that in the selection process for a leadership class, what is prioritized is different than the qualities needed to be good at that position. You see, in the leadership, I can speak with some experience because I went to an elite university in the United States, and I saw the young people, this is in the early 90s, the young people who would advance. And the people who advanced were not people who were capable in the job that they advanced into. They were very capable in the political game, in complying with what was required of these very rigid institutions that had certain ways and processes to advance. And so they advanced, but they didn't have the experience or the qualities necessary to be good at their positions. And so that's why you have so many functionaries from the West who have, for instance, they are charged and tasked with the relations with China, but they don't speak Chinese, they don't understand Chinese culture, they don't care about Chinese culture, but they were able to advance to the position of having to be the diplomat in China, not because they know China's culture and China's language and China's people, but because they had qualities that helped them advance in the career path in the West, you see? And so that's what's happened.
In some cases, I would say they almost intentionally find somebody who's anti-China to station in China, rather than somebody who has curiosity, right? Trying to learn, trying to understand. It's almost like they're afraid that this person stationed in China would be too sympathetic to China. You see what I mean? Why? I mean, that's just not making any sense, because you intentionally try.
No, but it makes complete sense if you, as an institution, you feel insecure in your strength, if you feel insecure in your power, see? Because people who are insecure do not have the strength of character to pay attention to what the other is thinking and wanting, okay? Because insecure people want things to be predictable and comfortable for themselves, you see? And so that's what's going on. And what I'm saying is like personal psychology. And you would say, well, how does like personal psychology play into geopolitical affairs? Well, ultimately, all diplomatic relations are personal between the functionaries, between the leadership cadres of the different countries. And so you have to pay attention to the psychology of the people in the leadership positions. And what is it that drove them forward, and why is it that they are in positions of leadership, and why are they acting as they do? You have to pay attention to the personal psychology of these people as a class. And see, when you start looking at it from that point of view, and understanding that the pressures that these functionaries in the West had in order to succeed were not the pressures that would bring out the best people, but rather the people who were most compliant, most willing to go along with an established ideology. And at this time, there is an anti-China ideology. And so, of course, the people who advance are the people who say, yes, of course, we will follow this anti-China ideology. We're not going to pay attention to China. We're not going to try to understand China or the Chinese people or their concerns or their ambitions. We're just going to follow along with our ideology, however divorced from reality it might happen to be, which is what's happening in the West. And that's why you in China and people in Russia, they come across representatives from the West who openly hate them. There's the new ambassador in the Kremlin, American ambassador in the Kremlin, and she very clearly doesn't care about Russia. She speaks Russian, but she doesn't care about Russia. She's not interested in Russia. She just wants to advance the interests of the United States at the expense of Russia, as opposed to acting in partnership with Russia, which is the way adults behave, see? I mean, you have to understand, these people from the West, they're spoiled children. If there's anything that your audience takes away from this conversation that we're having, is that understand that these are spoiled, insecure children who do not care they just want, because just like children, I mean, we've all had to deal with small children, and small
Yeah.
children are egotistical. They just want
Yeah.
me, because
Yeah.
they're children, right?
Uh-huh.
But as an adult, you realize this adult I'm facing has certain desires. I have certain desires. How can we work together so that we both, if not achieve everything that we want, at least achieve the important things that we both want? That's the adult attitude. But there are no adults in the West. The adults, the system that advances people through the leadership cadres in the West is designed to bring out these people who are very compliant, lacking any kind of independent thought, and supremely narcissistic and willing to follow an ideology. The capable people are almost deliberately squeezed out and marginalized. And that's why you find like a lot of people in the commentary community are extraordinarily capable. And you say, well, why
Yeah.
isn't this guy running something? He seems to know what the hell he's talking about.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's because
Yeah.
the system itself, because of age and because of an extended period of such stability and material well-being, that there was no need to change it, to fix it, to adapt. It was too easy. It's like, another way to put it. See, there is this man who's a coolie, you know, he was just a worker. He was just very poor, right? And he worked and saved and started little businesses, and he became rich. He became extremely rich. And what did he do with his children? Well, he kind of spoiled them, but the children had sort of learned the difficulties of life, so they were not complete idiots, right? But then the grandchildren who inherited the great fortune, they don't understand the costs that were required to earn this fortune. And so they throw this fortune away, thinking that the fortune is without limits, that it's infinite. But of course, it's not infinite. And that's what's happening in the West. That's one of the big shocks of the Western leadership, that they are running out of ammunition to send to Ukraine. Because they thought, well, you know, we have this huge military, we should have everything as much as we want. Why don't we just send it? And they're like, well, there's none left, you know, it's a finite amount. Resources are always finite.
Yeah.
And so that's why they're so shocked, because like I said, they are the grandchildren of the coolie who became rich and who pilfered away their grandfather's fortune. And then all of a sudden they're looking at the bank account and there's just nothing left. And they're like, what happened? And they panic. And that's where we are now. We are in the panic stage of this leadership class.
Yeah. Just so you know, China even hasn't sent an ambassador to the US for 3 months now.
That's very serious. That's extremely serious.
Yeah, because I think the last time they sent their ambassador here, Blinken didn't even meet him, which is very unusual. You know, it's an important country's ambassador.
That's an insult. That's
exactly.
An insult. Yeah.
And then what happened was when he finished here, he actually was promoted to become the foreign minister. Right now, the foreign minister in China is a former ambassador to the US. And Blinken kind of like awkward with him because, you know, he wasn't very polite, very nice to him. And then with that, I think they need to send a new one. They just decided, well, if you're going to treat him with no respect, we're just not sending anybody. I think that's where
that's terrible. That's terrible.
That's what's going on right now with China. You know, the two.
I mean, it's completely unsurprising that your current foreign minister was a former ambassador to the United States, of course, because who are you going to send as your ambassador to the United States? You know, the global hegemon, and you're one of your principal trading partners. You're going to send your best guy. Yeah. And so it's unsurprising that he would go from being ambassador to the United States to being a foreign minister. Perhaps it could have been that he didn't become foreign minister, but he'd have some high level position. So for Blinken to not even have accepted his accreditation and welcomed him to Washington, frankly, it should have been the president of the United States who would accept him as his credentials and welcomed him, because he, as a practical matter, again, you know, just a little bit of forethought as an adult. You're thinking this ambassador, he is likely going to be a big deal later. So it's good, if only as a pragmatic sense, to have a fluid and business-like relationship. But they act like children. This is the attitude of spoiled children, spoiled, arrogant children.
So you know, there's no ambassador right now from China.
Yeah. Yeah, and the Chinese eventually will probably send somebody. I mean, it's probably
Yeah.
just a message that they're sending,
Yeah.
but it's just stupid. It's
Yeah.
and in diplomacy, you know, the whole point of diplomacy is always keep the avenues for conversation open.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
the Western diplomatic corps, both European and American,
Mhm.
they have this bizarre notion that diplomats have to go to war with each other and you have to ignore what the other side says. Again, the attitude of children, of spoiled children, you know, because of course, you know, you can listen to what somebody else has to say and not like it, not agree with
Yeah.
it, and not
Mhm.
carry it out, but you at least listen, okay?
Yeah.
Because it's always better to have the communication channels open as opposed to closing them out of just petty ideology or some nonsense. But that's what they're doing because they're incompetent. They're incompetent. And this is the great danger for China. These incompetent people can, in their incompetence and their failure, they can wind up doing terrible damage and make decisions that you can't take back. And the Chinese are going to have to, the Chinese leadership is going to have to be extremely patient and careful. I don't know, because I truly believe that there is going to be a war between the United States and China. I mean, I don't say it with any kind of happiness. On the contrary, I think it would be a catastrophe for the world. But I do believe that the Americans are in such a panic mode, and their situation is so spiraling out of control that I think that they will decide that a war with China would be a good thing and would somehow fix all their problems, just like the Second World War fixed so many problems for the United States. But of course, the world is very different today than it was in 1941. And the world of today, if the United States were to go to war with China, it would be a catastrophe for the Americans. And it would certainly be very difficult for the Chinese. But it would be so catastrophic for the Americans that the Americans might decide to launch nuclear weapons. I think that that is a very real possibility. I think it's something that the Chinese leadership is probably very aware of. And they're probably trying to figure out a way that that doesn't happen. Because I think that the American leadership is quite frankly, it's going insane. I mean, it sounds outrageous for me to say this, but when you look at all of their actions and their stupidity and the decisions that anyone with a little common sense would say, no, this is going to have terrible consequences, don't do it, and they do it anyway. That leads me to conclude that it's an insane leadership class that China and Russia is going to have to deal with for the foreseeable future. Yeah.
And speaking of that, I want to ask you a thought about the indictment of Donald Trump, because that's one of those crazy things. Because before this, I thought the presidents, they have some kind of a consensus. They don't punish each other, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, there's a tacit consensus that you don't go after former president.
So you don't get into trouble when the new one come in, right? So I thought that was the consensus, but they broke that. I mean,
completely.
I'm just wondering whether Biden, doesn't he thinking a little bit ahead of time? What if he doesn't get reelected? He doesn't seem thinking any of that.
No, look, you have to understand. First of all, the crimes that Donald Trump is being accused of are process crimes. They're trivial. They are not crimes. First of all, the statute of limitation expired on these crimes. Number one. Okay, and number two, when you actually look at what the crime is, see, it's not actually a crime. Because there was no victim to it. Okay. And it was. It's too complicated to go into it now. But any legal expert who is honest will tell you this is just nonsense. This is just not real. And so the only reason that this is being carried out is as a punitive measure to hurt Donald Trump. Now, basically what you have is the Biden regime is fomenting the imprisonment of his principal opponent in the next election. This is banana republic stuff. This is just just ridiculous. And we're seeing it live happening, and everybody's sort of like shocked that this is happening because again, the American leadership class, they've gone around the bend. And on top of that, Obama Hillary Clinton, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, they've all done far worse crimes than what they're accusing Donald Trump of having done. And they're perfectly free and nothing's happening to them. And what does that tell you? You know, it's just despicable.
I mean, in particular, George W. Bush, he openly lied, right,
Oh,
to
yeah.
get U.S. into a war. I mean, there shouldn't be
much more
anything more
serious.
severe than that, right? But
Much more serious, yeah.
yeah, and the American soldiers died. It's not just Iraqis died, Americans died because of that. But nothing happens. And Obama's excuse, because when people ask him why didn't he, prosecute or some kind of punishment for George W. Bush, he said we need to move on.
Yeah.
Okay. If you have that argument, there is nothing you can punish, right? All the crimes has passed. It's always the past, right? Then you can just move on with everything. But anyway, so that was, I think that's fascinating. Just so you know that actually Donald Trump, compared with others in Biden and Clinton,
Oh yeah, he's
he
nothing.
but also in China, he's more popular than those people.
Oh sure. Well, he's a very charismatic figure, and he seems to be like a straightforward individual. I don't think I'm not a fan of Donald Trump.
No, I
think
either.
he's extremely ineffective.
Yeah.
But this case is absurd. And I say this as somebody who's indifferent to his political future. I don't care if he becomes president again or not, because I think he'd be equally ineffective. But what I find outrageous is this whole charade going on. And it's funny. It's just amusing in a very dark way. And it just shows more that the Americans are lost. They are lost as a people. And all you can do is just stand back and watch and hope that the thrashing around doesn't affect you. That's all you can do. Yeah.
And in China, the reason they like Trump better, not that they like him, but they like him better, both the government and the people, I would say, is because he's more straightforward. He started a trade war. Nobody likes the trade war, but he's more straightforward. Okay, he doesn't like the deficit, so he started a trade war.
Yeah.
Versus Biden,
he tells you to your face
yes,
what he's going to do, and he does it, or at least tries to do it. Whereas Biden, he lies to your face and does exactly the opposite of what he told you to your face he was going to do. And you find out later that he was always going to be doing this other thing. And so when he lied to you, he knew that he was lying to you. That's why the Chinese leadership hates Biden so much. That's why every leader hates Biden so much, because he is doing X. And when he goes to your face, he says, oh, no, we're doing this other thing. But he knows he's lying. And he keeps on doing the other thing. That's why everybody hates him. Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia hates his guts. Vladimir Putin does not like him at all. Xi Jinping also despises him because they lie. I mean, Xi said to Biden, you lied to me to my face over some issue.
The Taiwan thing
was just like, and Biden was like,
he said, he said to President Xi, oh, we recognize when China, Taiwan is part of it. In the meantime, he doesn't do anything with this visit by Nancy Pelosi, which is the same party. They're in the same party. If he want to stop her, he could.
Oh yeah,
right?
just a call.
And then if you look at their website on the State Department, they don't put in like Taiwan is part of China in there. It's the small things he just sneaky, very sneaky.
Yeah, but what's going on is that they are deliberately trying to provoke the Chinese into an overreaction.
Yeah.
Okay? The whole point of Nancy Pelosi going to Taiwan, and by the way, the new
Kevin McCarthy.
Kevin McCarthy, he also wants to go or is going or something. I don't know how it is, but he's going to do something similar.
He's going to meet her today. At least that's according to what his office is saying. They're going to meet today in Los Angeles. Yeah, something like that.
All of this is just provocation. All of this is just provocation to provoke the Chinese into an overreaction. That's the whole purpose of it. Whether it succeeds or not, time will tell. But these provocations are going to continue to escalate. These provocations are going to continue. And I think that what will happen probably is that at some point, the Americans are going to cross a red line that the Chinese say, okay, we're done. And there will be some war. You know, insofar as this SMO is concerned here in Ukraine, the United States, under the guise of NATO, provoked the Russians, provoked them, and then finally the Russians said, okay, we're just going to have to go through with this war. You know, I mean, that's the American mode of action. And they always say the same thing. Oh, you know, they attacked unprovoked. No, that's a lie. There were all of these provocations over years. And finally, the target of the provocation said, you know, enough. I don't know how the Chinese leadership is going to handle this in particular. If they are going to be very patient and cautious and never react to a provocation, no matter how bad, or if they will say at some point, you know, enough. And then the Americans will have the excuse of like, oh, we didn't do anything. We were just being innocent little snowflakes, and the bad Chinese attacked us or something, you know? I think that that is the game of the Americans, and the Chinese leadership will have to be very clever in order to outsmart these provocations of the Americans, because these provocations are severe.
Yeah, and they will continue.
Serious.
Yeah. Last thing is, I want to ask you about the de-dollarization. So,
oh yeah.
so what do you see is happening? You know, it's faster than what we expected, at least
Much faster
than what I expected.
Yeah.
So where are we heading? And I also more curious, what is the world in particular for Americans? You know, what is the world going to be when dollar is no longer the reserve currency?
What is the dollar going to be once the dollar? What is going to happen to the Americans?
Yeah.
After the dollar is no longer the reserve currency, well, they're going to go bankrupt, and they're going to have to print dollars in order to pay all their bills. And the dollars that they print will become progressively more worthless, and they will have hyperinflation, and that's the inevitable outcome. This is the inevitable outcome. It might take a while, because there are very clever people who will try to keep the system, the American system, afloat. But the outcome is inevitable, because if the rest of the world de-dollarizes, then there will be no more demand for for American bonds. Because remember, the United States emits bonds that it sells to the rest of the world, and those bonds, the cash that comes in, they use it to finance their deficits. And see, if the rest of the world stops buying treasury bonds, then the only solution is for the American Federal Reserve to start printing more money so that the American government can pay its liabilities. And when that much more money starts entering circulation, the dollar starts losing its value and becomes worthless, like Weimar Germany. And so, yeah, that seems to be the inevitable outcome of this situation. And so, and precisely because of that economic collapse, the American leadership class would have a greater incentive to go forth to war as a way to disguise and hide the problem of a collapsing economy, you see? And that's why these next 3 years are going to be among the most dangerous in human history, because we are seeing the collapse of the first global hegemon, and we are watching it collapse in real time. And you know, it is collapsing, and what will happen because of it, nobody knows. Sorry about that. That's the air raid siren here in Kharkov. So maybe this is a good point to wind down the show.
Yeah.
As the sirens blare. I don't know if you can hear it, but yeah, I can't do anything about it. Yeah.
That's fine. Well, one more thing is, do you want to say a few words about your upcoming book? Whatever you can tell us. Is that political thing?
No, it'll be a while. It'll be quite a few months. So I'll leave that for later. But yeah, I'm writing something. I mean, by trade, I'm a writer, and I'm writing basically an explanation as to how we got to where we are. That's basically the story of this book. And yeah.
I'm looking forward to it. Now, is there anything more you want to tell the Chinese audience before I let you go?
No, I think I pretty much covered it. And I want to thank you very much for having me on. It's been a real pleasure. And I hope that my perspective has helped your audience. And
yes.
And anytime you want me on again, I'm happy to come on a broadcast.
Yeah, I'm gonna say, you know, the election, the war, you know, de-dollarization, all these things happening. So I would like to check back with you. So, okay.
Sure, no problem.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Take
Thank you.
care.